on.
This happened at a Tulga one day too. Okay, it's on. Okay, great. Hello, can everyone hear me? Hi. No, you can't hear me. Yes, you can. Am I on?
Yeah, you're
okay.
on. You're on.
I think this is as loud as it gets, so I'll just project. Thanks everyone for coming to this lunch. I am here with Todd Stern, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a distinguished fellow at the World Resources Institute, and previously he was the special envoy for climate change at the State Department, where he led the US effort in climate negotiations, including the Paris Agreement. So as some of us know, President Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement last year, which has really dealt a major blow to our international efforts to combat and contain global warming. Meanwhile, climate change is affecting countries all over the world, including in the US, from Alaska to the coastal communities in Florida. So today we're going to talk about how this happened and where do we go from here. So this is a health conference. I am wondering, and I'm sure many of us are, what does climate change have to do with health? How does the climate impact human health?
So first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all for coming. And I'm going to answer your question, Olga. But I first want to just say that I'm making a note to self that anytime I want a big crowd, serve a good lunch. So that's. No, look, climate change is actually a major public health issue. It is now, and it's going to become much more so going forward. If you think about the panoply of impacts that climate change produces, they all have significant health consequences. Extreme heat waves, superstorms of the sort that we've seen really all over the world in recent years. Most recently, Hurricane Harvey here, but Hurricane Sandy years ago. Can you hear me? Are we okay? I'll talk louder. Droughts, floods, all manner of these kinds of impacts from climate change have obvious health impacts as well. You also have phenomenon such as the increasing warming temperatures in places that didn't used to be as warm, then increase the range of disease-carrying insects like mosquitoes, whether it's Zika or dengue fever or malaria. So in all sorts of ways, climate change, as I say, it's happening now. It's going to be a lot worse, and it's absolutely a public health issue.
Yeah. And you participated in several of these climate negotiations under several different administrations, actually. I was wondering if you could just kind of brief us, what are these climate negotiations like? What do they do? And how is Paris different?
So I was in the Obama administration when I got kind of drafted into working on climate change in 1997, which I did for a couple of years. And then I came in at the beginning with President Obama. Climate change negotiations. So look, climate change is a problem which is quintessentially global. The way that you deal with climate change is caused fundamentally by burning fossil fuels, also by releasing CO2 through things like deforestation, but the energy system is the most important piece. And the action that needs to be taken is usually done at a national level or even a subnational level, but it's a quintessentially global issue because unlike most other environmental issues that can be dealt with locally, you have local air pollution, local water pollution, toxic chemicals, whatnot, those can be dealt with locally. With climate change, the CO2 that gets emitted goes up to the atmosphere and mixes all around the world, so whether it's done in India or Indianapolis, it doesn't make any difference. So you have to bring all countries to the table. You have to get everybody engaged. And without an international agreement, you're not going to get countries having the confidence to take strong action unless they see that their counterparts, and in some cases their competitors, are actually doing the same thing. So you do need an international agreement. The Granddaddy Agreement was done. It was a sort of broad framework agreement in 1992. At some level, ever since, from 1992 to 2015, there was an effort to take the next step forward and create a real operational agreement that would include specific commitments by countries to reduce their emissions and so forth. And for a long time, climate negotiations are hard for reasons I could explain if you want me to, but it took a long time. There were various efforts that seemed to get going and then failed. And so Paris is the first time that we have what is in principle a very strong and workable agreement if we can keep it going.
And it was 195 countries, you said, had to agree on this one thing.
Yes, it's 195 countries, and the rule of procedure essentially in international climate negotiations is a consensus rule, which means basically everybody's got to agree. I mean, if you have 3 or 4 countries that raise their hand and say, we don't like it, you've got no deal. So you have and climate change, for the reasons that I just said a minute ago, involves the entire economy of countries all over the world. It's about burning fossil fuels. You burn fossil fuels to run your economy. So it's not like some issues that are important and not easy, but much less hard. We had a problem with the ozone hole that was fundamentally repaired through an agreement back in the late 80s called the Montreal Protocol. Hard, but probably 20 countries produced the chemicals that were causing the problem, and they were just a few chemicals. So not easy, but climate change, it's the whole world, it's your whole economy, and you have to get everybody to agree, so it's not easy.
It's very difficult. But you did it. Yeah, so 194 countries plus the U.S. agreed to this. What did the U.S. agree to do under Paris?
Well, so Paris calls for all countries to Paris does a bunch of things. So first of all, as I said, it's universal, and everybody engaged, all countries are called upon to take action. This is very different from the earlier best effort to do something on climate change in 1997, which was the Kyoto Protocol, which had a big flaw in it, which is that it only applied to developed countries, and all developing countries were kind of left off the hook, which wasn't good from the point of view of reducing emissions and was ruinous politically for the United States. So Paris is universal. It calls on all countries to put forward what in the lingo is called nationally determined contributions, but your own targets for how you're going to reduce emissions. It puts in place a whole system of accountability for countries reporting and being reviewed on how they're doing and on their periodic, basically every 2 years or so, inventories of emissions. It does a whole set of things like that go to the core of reducing emissions. It also includes provisions on countries taking action to adapt to climate change that's going to happen no matter how good we do on reducing emissions. It has provisions for providing financial assistance to poor countries and so forth. But the things that, let me just focus on what was different about Paris as compared to anything else that had happened in climate negotiations and where there was fundamentally a paradigm shift. That was first of all on this notion that the targets are nationally determined. If you go back to Kyoto, those were negotiated targets. The people who developed countries had to negotiate with each other about what they would all accept. This is different. Countries put forward their own targets, and that's on a nationally determined basis. So that's one important element. The kind of central fault line in climate negotiations from the beginning has been a kind of absolute sort of firewall separation between developed and developing countries. Certainly there should be differentiation between them because you can't expect poor countries or even not so poor but more developed but not all the way to do the same thing as the fully developed industrialized countries. And yet, it had become, as I said, this kind of firewall, most exemplified in Kyoto, where literally nothing was expected from China, from India, Brazil, all of those countries. And that was modified. It wasn't completely abandoned. As I said, you shouldn't have abandoned it, but it was made much more supple, if you will, not a firewall anymore. That was critical. And the other thing is that the targets are, it is a legal hybrid. So the agreement is partly legally binding and partly not. So there are requirements to report on how you're doing. As I said before, those are legally binding. Your targets are not legally binding. And again, that was an essential feature in order to be able to bring all the countries of the world on board.
So because it's not legally binding, as you were telling me earlier, no one goes to jail if you don't meet these targets, right? So, but yet President Trump announced his intention to pull out of it anyway. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for climate change in the US, but also what does it mean for the US's stature in these climate negotiations that are still going on?
Well, look, I think, and I wrote a lot about this back before he made the decision to pull out, and I've written about it since then. It's hugely damaging. The U.S. is, Madeleine Albright once said the U.S. is the indispensable player, the indispensable country in international, in the international scene. And in my experience, it's absolutely true. I mean, the U.S. was critical in working through all of these various different issues over time, coming up with ideas that hadn't been floated before, or working with somebody else who'd come up with a good idea that we thought could work. And we had the capacity to have a very, I think, in some sense, maybe the most important bilateral interaction over a number of years with the Chinese to get at the level of President Obama and President Xi to move these two sort of former, still to some extent antagonists, but the two biggest players to come together, the capacity to bring coalitions of countries together. All of that goes away when the U.S. isn't participating at the senior political level. It doesn't mean countries drop out. They're not dropping out. I didn't think they would drop out. They're not. I mean, they are determined to continue working on climate change, but it won't be as effective. There's a whole set of, and I'm really not going to go deep into this because even with lunch you'd want to leave if I went deep into this, but there's a whole set of follow-up negotiations that are going on right now that involve the guidelines and sort of implementing elements that need to be done to basically get Paris from an agreement into a fully working regime. Those are happening right now, and they're not going that well because the U.S. isn't there, in my judgment. At least that's an important part of the reason. And the other thing is that, so if you step back and think about these 9 non-binding targets, I mean, a lot of people have said, particularly people who are not right in the negotiations, but pundits who are kind of popping off, like, well, Paris doesn't mean anything much anyway because the targets aren't binding. So the thing is, again, that there wasn't a way to get binding targets that everybody was going to agree to. You couldn't have put it together that way. But also, the theory of the case here, the theory of the case with Paris is fundamentally different. It's a theory which is built on the notion that there will be developing norms and expectations among countries enforced by kind of political pressure to keep doing what we need to do and to keep increasing what we need to do over time. The agreement, by the way, includes very strong, it sets a pathway in a way that had not been done before. There's very strong goals with respect to limiting temperature increase. There's a system of cycles of every 5 years for countries to re-up what they've done. So all of this is built on again, a notion of developing norms and expectations. When the biggest guy in town pulls out and says, "I'm not interested," again, that doesn't help. The shorter this little interlude, which is important for reasons that you read about in the paper every day, way beyond climate change. The shorter it lasts, the less damage it'll do. But it
And
does
by
damage.
interlude, you mean the U.S. not being at the table?
I mean the Trump administration.
I was trying to be diplomatic, but sure. So let's talk about kind of this figure 2 degrees Celsius. What does it mean? Why is that important to climate change?
Yeah, so the 2 degrees comes from a kind of scientific consensus, and this is already, I think the first time that the 2 degree number found its way into an international agreement was in the Copenhagen Accord, which is a short agreement that we did in Obama's first year. There's a big climate change meeting, by the way, at the end of every year. So every December, more or less, there is the next conference of the parties. Paris was COP21. First one was all the way back in 1995. And Copenhagen was in 2009. And that was the first time there was a reference, I think, to 2 degrees. And it comes from a scientific consensus that's roughly, it's not magic. It's not that we're fine at 1.9 and we're screwed at 2.1. But it's a rough consensus among scientists that if we can keep the increase in global temperature as compared to roughly pre-industrial times below that, we will avoid the worst kinds of damage. Now, let me just say we are so far about, that's 2 degrees Celsius, okay, which is about 3.6 Fahrenheit. So far, we're about 1 degree Celsius above that pre-industrial period. And there's a ton of stuff going on in terms of climate change impacts all over the world. Temperatures, sea level rise, storms, precipitation, droughts, all of this stuff is happening. It's not happening unconnected to climate change. It doesn't happen, the storm doesn't happen because of climate change. The storm gets a lot worse because of climate change. The place where that's maybe different is, probably is different, is sea level. Sea level is really significantly happening because of climate change. But in any event, you have all of those things going on, and the message from scientists has been keep it below 2 degrees. There's a lot of push now in the international community, particularly among the most vulnerable countries, and in this case, we're talking about the small islands, that are pushing for 1.5 degrees. I think 1.5 degrees as a practical matter is, well, let me just say so I don't get myself in trouble, it will be extraordinarily difficult to hold temperature increase that low. It'll be very difficult to hold it below 2, but it can be done. And again, it's an estimate. So really bad things could happen before that. The really bad things might happen even a little bit where it's a little bit higher than that, but that's where it comes from.
And in all of your time working on this, how has the U.S. government's approach to climate change shifted, or maybe the mindset of U.S. leaders shifted in your view? And also I'm interested in the business community. How has the business community changed its thinking about climate change?
Let me take the second part first. So I got, as I said before, I got kind of drafted into working on climate change in 1997 when I was working in the White House, minding my own business, doing other things for President Clinton. And I'm sorry, I just lost your. Business.
Yeah.
So my assignment was to be the point person to work with stakeholders, business, environmental groups, labor, et cetera. Also to work on communications of what was going on to the public, and also to work on the policy piece of getting ready to go to Kyoto. And there's a quite dramatic difference if you look at the business community then and now, because big business was almost across the board negative on taking climate change action. Back in 1997 when I was doing this, I used to say I was the only guy in the White House who could bring business and labor together because they both hated me. And they were both negative on climate. And if you look now, I would say you had virtually the entire Fortune 500 type CEOs in the US supportive of staying in Paris. There were very, very few outside stakeholders now in 2017, a year ago, when Trump was making this decision, who were for pulling out. I mean, they were for staying in for good reason. I mean, we're 20 years further advanced from 1997. People can see how serious this is. I think business saw that we had pulled off an agreement that was on the one hand ambitious, but on the other hand was something they could live with. They could see where the direction of history was, and they could see what was going on all around the world. They didn't want to be on the outs. And by the way, also, when you have the U.S. fully in, you've got the U.S. negotiating team there, and they're looking out for American interests as well as the global. So when proposals are made, and they're made all the time, that would be damaging in ways that we didn't at all think was legitimate to U.S. and, for that matter, other businesses, we were the strongest force to stop that stuff. So I think from business's standpoint, it made absolutely no sense to pull out of Paris, and yet Trump did it anyway. Look, Trump did this. I can't tell you exactly why he did it. I think fundamentally it was a political decision, playing to his base and playing to some number of ideologues within his administration who, are still kind of climate deniers. But the business side of things, with the exception of perhaps, some parts of the coal industry, I think even the oil companies fundamentally were all on board for staying in Paris, because better to stay in Paris than to be on the outside.
That's interesting. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not playing devil's advocate, but I have taken reporting trips to Trump country and, interviewed people who live in mining areas, and they really they didn't like Obama. They really felt like their jobs were at stake if coal was somehow deprioritized in the economy. Anything they heard that was against coal was very frightening to them, because it's already a very poor region and they were very worried about their livelihoods. I guess what would you say to people in that situation, or what do you think could be done to mitigate some of those negative impacts?
So, I'm totally sympathetic to people in coal country. I mean, people in coal country have helped, build the country, build the U.S. They haven't done anything wrong. They work hard. They do super tough jobs, and they have every right to be concerned. My view is that obviously you can't. This is a hugely important global problem. You can't say, well, never mind. But what I think you can do in ways that frankly, I think Hillary Clinton was on. I don't think she didn't do everything perfect on her visits, but I think that she was pretty focused on doing a major kind of program to try to do economic development in places like West Virginia and other places. And coal miners don't like to hear that, but the other thing that's crazy about this is there's an incredibly small number of people in the coal industry. I mean, we have something like 3 million clean energy jobs in the U.S. right now, and that's shooting upwards. I don't hold me to these numbers exactly, because I might be off a little bit, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 people, maybe 60. I mean, it's small. It's a smaller in the coal industry. This is a smaller number than work at a lot of big companies, which is not to denigrate at all. Just the opposite. I mean, my point is really, we should pour the money in that we need to take care of people who are in that kind of position, particularly both because they deserve it and because they have a tremendous amount of political clout, given where they're located in states that they each have 2 senators, and I mean, it's the smart thing to do, and it's the decent thing to do, but you can't say, well, because of this, we should back off. We have to go. The truth is, we have to go about 5 times faster than we're going now.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to also ask about...
Not 5 per se, but a lot faster.
Right, much faster. So there's also a contingent of people who aren't threatened by the transition to clean energy or the move away from fossil fuels, but they just simply deny the fact that climate change is a problem. And you do have some of those people in the federal government now. I was wondering if you've come across any strategies for persuading people to believe in climate change, or how should we deal with climate denialism, basically?
Well, so I'm going to get myself in trouble now, but I couldn't resist noting privately. I went to a very good session this morning by I'm bad with Dava, forgetting the last name, but a NASA scientist. She's terrific, and she's at MIT now. Talking about the kind of view of the Earth that NASA has because of its use of satellites, and how sort of seriously challenged the vital signs of the world of the Earth are, and how much the imperative for action is therefore kind of manifest. And I couldn't help noting to myself that it was that her lecture took place in the David Koch building, and that just I won't say anything more on that, but I'm just going to come back to your question, which is denialism, and that's been going on for a long time. I think that there was a lot of that back in 1997, getting financed by fossil fuel industry and various kind of funded offshoots. So I think that there's that has had an impact on people for sure. I also think that if you think about the political problems we face, that is a real one, and it helps to contribute to the fact that if you try to get action on climate on Capitol Hill, you run into huge difficulty, and it's a kind of a third rail issue for many members of Congress to touch. If you look at the broader public, denialism is a diminishing problem.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, you have probably 70% of the country, high 60s anyway, who understand that climate change is real. We've got to take action. I think you were well into the 70s who supported Paris, who supported the Clean Power Plan, which is a big action that President Obama undertook. So it exists, but the other thing, the other reason that it's I think a diminishing problem over time is generationally. I mean, if you look at the polling for younger people, again, the numbers are just that much stronger. So, I mean, the political problem with respect to climate change is huge, but it's not just that.
Yeah. And you said that we should be moving maybe 5 times faster, significantly faster. What should we be doing exactly? What should we be seeing that we're not? Well,
the name of the game here is a transformation of the global, of the energy base of the global economy, right? I mean, so the fossil fuels, carbon emissions come from the vehicle sector, from burning oil, from the power sector, burning coal, and it comes from the other big places, buildings use tons of energy. Again, that's mostly supplied by the power sector, not all. And industry, which again, partly electricity supplied by the power sector, and partly industrial processes that need fossil fuels, and so there's probably a piece that's the fossil fuel side of this and the energy side of this is probably in the mid 60% range of the total. The land use. Cutting down forests and to some extent agriculture is another big piece. And then there's some elements of the greenhouse gas equation that are not CO2. There's other things like methane. Yeah. It's fundamentally it's getting much more of our power from things like solar and wind. It's getting battery storage that allows you to run power plants on coal and wind most of the time, even though they're obviously intermittent. The sun might not be shining, the wind might not be blowing. Electric cars. There's in every way that currently burns fossil fuel, you look for ways not to do that. And there is tremendous progress going on in these sectors. If you look at if we had graphs, you would see that the penetration, the uptake of solar energy is like that, and wind is the same way. The cost curves for those things are coming dramatically down. The cost curves for battery storage, which again is hugely important, going dramatically down. A huge innovation with respect to electric vehicles and all sorts of things. There's a company now that has a technology that it is demonstrating, and so far very successfully, where they can get zero carbon, they can run zero carbon natural gas plants by essentially using CO2 to run the turbines rather than steam, and then burying and recycling over and over again the CO2, and then burying the CO2 that you don't need for that purpose, and being able to do it as cheaply or more cheaply than an average power plant now. If that pans out, that's huge. There's another company that is in the process of coming up with a radical potential to radically improve the efficiency of electricity. You might think, well, so efficiency of electricity, what's that, a little bit? So 2/3 of all the energy used for the US electricity system, 2/3 is waste. 2/3. So, and it's not waste because people aren't turning off the lights or something. It's not about that. It's about losses in various kinds of conversion. And if you ask me a single question more than that, I won't be able to answer. But it's, again, if this, and it's not just pie in the sky, that very serious people think that this is going to work. So there's my point is there's all sorts of things that are happening in this direction. The other side of the coin, though, is all of the predictions about what was going to happen in terms of bad impacts in science, the predictions about how fast sea level was going to rise, all of those kinds of things are also worse than were originally projected. So we're basically in a kind of race against time. We're directionally doing fine. If directionally doing fine was enough, we could all go home and relax. But it's not in this case. So that's the challenge.
What are the impediments, though, of getting there? I mean, you mentioned earlier, I liked your quote that politics is harder than rocket science, and you mentioned that it's a third rail sometimes when you try to bring this up with certain people. Why is that?
So look, I'll put it this way. We can do exactly what we need to do from the point of view, with respect to all of that transformation that I was just talking about, from the point of view of innovation, nobody better than in the United States, but it's also happening around the world. From the point of view of policy, we know what kind of policies to put in place to drive, to put in place incentives to make this happen, and to remove the crazy incentive that still exists for producing fossil fuels. And we can afford it. I mean, there was a super interesting, if you're geeky like me, study by Citibank 2 or 3 years ago, where they looked at about a 30-year time period, and they compared a full-out action scenario on climate change versus no action, right? And their analysis was the overall costs were almost the same, slightly less for the full-on action. None of this was counting the damages from climate change. This is putting aside the damages from climate change. It's just because you have to put in a bunch of money up front to do the innovation. You have to put in a bunch of money in capital expenditures to build the solar and wind and so forth facilities. But then you know what happens when you get those up? You don't pay for fuel. The fuel's from the sun, the fuel's from the wind, and so forth. So yes, we can afford it. So innovation, check. Policy, check. Finance, check. The hard part, political will. That's the hard part, and it's the super hard part, and it's hard all over the world, and there's very few places where leaders are juiced up as much as they should be. And then you have the extra problems that we have in the US, partly from the denial community, and partly, and this at some level I think this is even more difficult, is a sense that if we are directionally moving in the right, we're directionally doing what we need to do, that there's a kind of implicit sense that gradual progress is okay. Because gradual progress usually is okay. Rome's not built in a day. We all know that. If we're trying to get better systems and for all sorts of things in our policy world, and we're making good progress, but not quite as much as we'd like, that's still good. But here it's not good enough. And so we need people, and now I'm talking about people who were my colleagues in the White House, my colleagues at Brookings, my colleagues when I taught recently at Yale, and on and on and on. And I'm not criticizing them. There's no reason why most people understand how fast we have to go, but we do, and there is a huge need to kind of conquer those political challenges, dealing with the people who are on the not denialist side. But again, I think mostly time is going to deal with that, but also so that people of goodwill understand and then can apply the kind of political pressure that needs to be applied. And of course, leadership, the right kind of leadership at the top in the U.S. is hugely important. I will say that we shouldn't go through this whole session without my pointing out that in response to to President Trump's announcement, June 1st of last year, there has been a tremendous mobilization at the state, local, civil society level. There's a U.S. Climate Alliance of now 16 or 17 states. There's hundreds of cities. There's a great many companies that are putting forward their own targets on what to do. And all of that has been very encouraging and also encouraging both from the point of view of the actual emissions that can be reduced, but also important here, and in some sense even more important globally, to send the message that Washington has gone dark on this issue, but the United States, America more broadly, has not. So that's been really important.
Yeah, and you mentioned that we're in a little bit of a race against time, and I'm just wondering what happens if we lose the race. So what are some of the impacts of climate change that you were already seeing in your work, and also what might happen if it gets even worse?
Well, I mean, you have more and more serious and more and more extreme storms that are not just more in number, but more in their extremity. You have sea level was for a long time, including up until quite recently, projected to go up by somewhere between 1 and 3 feet this century. That's now gone, the top line there has gone up to 6 feet because of a new scientific understanding of the dynamics of the way ice is melting in Antarctica. A little bit Greenland also, but especially Antarctica, where you could have 6 or 8 or 10 feet in this century. Well, you have 50% of the world's population right now lives in cities. 50% of the major cities in the world are essentially on coasts. You could, sea level rise is a hugely dangerous thing, which also then contributes to much greater storm surges when there are storms. You have a potential serious impact on water. I mean, what we have. If there was no climate change, we would have a big water problem in the world right now in terms of the availability, the adequacy of fresh water in many, many countries. Climate change makes that worse. There are, I think, very serious concerns. I think this is less nailed down, but very serious concerns about the impact on food. You could, if you want to think about how serious this is, you don't have to go any further than the Pentagon. I mean, the Pentagon, the Quadrennial Review, the QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review, I guess it is, has talked about the enormous national security risk that climate change presents as a kind of threat multiplier for all sorts of other things that are already going on in various countries. And Tom Friedman, the columnist in the New York Times, has written quite extensively about the precursors to what has happened in Syria. Not that the Syrian debacle is because of climate change, but there was a very severe drought for a number of years. There's something like 1.5 million Syrians from the country started moving into the cities, and in his view, and it's a pretty educated view, greatly exacerbated the social and political tensions. Again, it's not like, well, that's, if you hadn't had Assad, you doubtless wouldn't have had this problem. But that's the kind of threat multiplier that the Pentagon's talking about. So,
yeah.
Across the board, a lot of scary stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for a few questions. If you guys have a question, I think the first hand I saw was over there. There's going to be mic runners coming to you. Yep, the woman over there. Yep.
Do you think the California Climate Summit in September can have any impact? And if so, what type of impact?
So I think that it's great that California is doing that summit. And I've been, collaborating with them a bit on the planning, as have many other people. And California, under Governor Brown, has probably the single best all-around program on dealing with climate change anywhere in the world. And since California is, I always forget the exact number, but it's something like the 7th biggest economy in the world, that matters. I think that the summit is a big opportunity to, I think there'll be a number of different things that happen there, but I think that it's meant to convey the level of action and commitment and activity that's taking place at the subnational level all over the world, in the US, but in many other communities. I think it's an opportunity to help convey the message of the seriousness of the challenge, of what can be done, but also of what needs to be done. I think it's very important for the international community to see this mobilization and this action that's happening in the United States, because people don't want to lose hope that the U.S. is just gone. And at a lesser level, when President Bush pulled the U.S. out of the effort to make Kyoto work, Kyoto was a very, very flawed agreement. So I'm not going to spend time criticizing President Bush, but he didn't do it the way I would have done it. But in any event, for most of those 8 years, from the international perspective, the U.S. seemed like it was just kind of quiet, just kind of faded out. And really important that not happen now. So again, I think that the California summit is the most visible, high-level manifestation of U.S. commitment, and I'm all for it.
I think that woman right there with her hand up in the black shirt. Yep.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for recognizing the urgency of the issue. And while I was listening to you, you just kind of like reconfirmed everything that I already knew, which I so desperately want not to be true, especially with the sea level rising. I come from Maldives. So when you talked about it's very difficult to keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, but as you know, and I know realistically it's almost impossible to keep it at 1.5 or even to get there. So what kind of recourses do we have, and what kind of planning should we be looking at for small island states which are essentially going to disappear, and populations, like what do we do about it? What kind of planet should be like statelessness? Where do we go? Where do we live? What would be our rights? So where do we start looking at solutions for these questions?
Yeah, so you're asking one of the hardest questions in regard to climate change. And I should say back in 2009, Maldives is a very small place. The president of the Maldives then, and there's been all sorts of politics, and he ended up no longer being the president, and I don't know the insides and outs of the politics there. But President Nasheed, I think, right, was... What'd you say?
I was in his government.
All right, okay, so I won't get in trouble with you, but he was, I mean, talk about somebody who punched above his weight. Maldives is a small place, and he was eloquent and powerful in the direction of big players on both sides. So holding China's feet and others to the fire as well as everybody else, which I thought was very important. Look, I think the first step is obviously the change has to happen as fast as it possibly can. The closer that we can get, the more we can get below 2, the more we can get toward 1.5, the better. But it's got all of those hurdles that I talked about earlier. I think that this is an area where we need the larger this issue comes up a lot in the context of the climate negotiations, and there is an idea called loss and damage, and there was a loss and damage mechanism, to use the technical word, that was set up a few years ago to help work on this. But I have been saying for some time that I think the larger UN family of the UN itself and other UN organizations have to be seized with this problem. There may be ways to physically do things with some of the islands that could help them weather a higher degree of sea level. And there may be cases where populations are going to have to move. And it's, one hopes it doesn't get there, but it might get there. And that's not something that's going to get sorted out through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change body. That has to be a part of, that has to be one of the players at the table, but this is going to take a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of international cooperation, and I don't have an easy answer. There was a group of a few countries that was set up a few years ago to start kind of thinking about this. Of course, I'm forgetting the name of it, but and we became part of that, but it didn't last for long. What? No. The High Ambition Coalition was a coalition that helped get Paris done. Now I'm talking about something else, but it's a very hard problem that you're raising, and something that the world is going to have to work on jointly.
Right over here, maybe. I saw your hand first. The guy in the striped shirt with the beard. Yep.
Obviously, India and China are very important to this problem. Could you comment on their efforts, please?
So two things. China and India are very important. One should always keep in mind, and it drives my Indian colleagues crazy when it's not kept in mind, that China is about 5 times larger than India in terms of its contribution to the CO2. China is acting quite intensively now, and I think in the last number of years, and I think more in terms of developing clean energy sources. They're the biggest producer of solar and wind and so forth in the world. I think that they were engaged on climate change before. I think the thing that really ratcheted this up all the way to the level of their president was that they started to understand that their air pollution, conventional air pollution problem, was becoming a threat to stability. And nothing gets the attention of the Chinese like a threat to stability. So I think so that continues to be a big issue. I think they've also made the dead right-on calculation, which is just from a purely economic view, with kind of thing that makes you, kind of tear your hair out with respect to the Trump administration. The Chinese understand, as our guys don't, that the race to develop clean energy is going to be one of the biggest economic plays of this century. It's a huge, huge market. And at the moment, and we're still engaged in it. I mean, the real economy in the United States is still, pushing in this direction, but it would push better and faster with the right incentives. So in many respects, China is doing a lot. They're also, in the neighborhood of 25% of global emissions by themselves now. We were 3 times the size of China in 1992 at the time of the first climate treaty, and China's about twice our size now, and that that disparity continues to grow. So they're doing a lot, but they're not doing enough, and they're still using way too much coal. Coal has more or less coming close to peaking in China, so that's at least good. The other thing that is important is the Chinese are embarked, and have been for a while now, but their kind of biggest international initiative is a thing called the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative, if I'm remembering the number right from the New York Times some time ago, is 7 times the size of the Marshall Plan. It's gigantic. And it's meant to build infrastructure all across the old Silk Road from China to Europe, but then it goes way beyond that. It's also meant to go to Africa, Latin America, and so forth. They have a huge opportunity there to have the Belt and Road be a green one. So instead of building coal plants, they're building much less polluting. They're building renewable energy if possible. Natural gas if that's not possible, but and so far it's not a great record. So far they're building way too much coal. There are a bunch of people there who are focused on that, so we'll have to see. India is a mixed bag. President Modi committed to a huge amount of a ramp up of solar and wind several years ago. They're doing it. They're probably behind schedule, but even if they miss it by a few years, it's a tremendous increase from where they were before. But they still have tons of coal and bad coal. No coal is good coal, but some coal is worse. And they have it's a pretty chaotic intergovernmental system in India. It's not easy to make things happen quickly. So some progress, but not nearly enough.
Well, this is such a big topic, but unfortunately we're out of time for today. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Todd, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.